Hi all, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my show where we talk about storytelling in all its forms. On the show, I talk to artists, journalists, researchers, other writers, of course, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. This week's guest is Eliza Chan, a Scottish-born Chinese-diaspora author who writes about East Asian mythology, British folklore, and reclaiming the Dragon Lady, but preferably all three at once. Eliza's work has been published in The Dark, Podcastle, Fantasy Magazine, and The Best of British Fantasy, and her nonfiction has appeared on Tor.com. She lives in the north of England with her partner and young child. Fathomfolk is her first novel. So thank you for coming, Eliza. Really excited to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Your first book, Fathomfolk, can you tell our listeners briefly about it?
Yes, of course. Brought on props here. Fathomfolk is, in a nutshell, what if the Little Mermaid was a pissed off immigrant in a semi-flooded East and Southeast Asian inspired city, and it was never about the love of a man, it was about the love of her home. So it's a modern fantasy set in a cityscape, and the Fathomfolk are a range of different sea mythological creatures, from mermaids to kelpies, kappas, and water dragons, and everything in between, who reside in the city alongside humans, but are treated as second-class citizens, basically. And it's a multi-point of view story which follows three of the Fathomfolk and their different ways and ideas of enacting change in their city.
Thank you for that. So while I was reading, at first, I kind of just looking at the cover of it and the Chinese motifs, I just first settled into seeing what I thought was going to be sort of set up styled after the imperial Chinese bureaucracy. And then we sort of get introduced to different elements of different folklores. So, we see the main character is a siren, but at first I paid it no mind because it's present in so many different cultures. Then we see a mention of Rusałka, which made me pay attention because that's a Slavic spirit. Then we get the Celtic Kelpie, the Japanese Kappa, Korean Jangjamari, I think it's pronounced right. So
Yeah.
how did you arrive at this sort of bringing all of those different world folklores together? Because of course, different world folklores have different sort of structures when it comes to the laws governing them and the different values. And why did you opt to put it all together?
It's a funny one because I think it comes from my love of folklore generally. So I've always been fascinated, and from a kid, I used to obviously look at the British ones, and then the Greek and things like that. And then I was always keen to learn more about the Chinese folklore, but I struggled to find stories to read growing up because I don't read in Chinese. So it was very much whatever I could grab, and it became super exciting as I got older and I traveled a bit. Wherever I went, I would try and pick up a book of folklore. I just want to, I sort of saw it as a way to learn a bit about whatever country I was visiting, and it became, other people have magnets or key rings. I picked up books of folklore, and I did a lot of traveling and living in different countries myself, and I found there was these commonalities. I wouldn't say between the stories, because obviously every culture, as you say, is separate, and the way they use folklore is different. But there's a lot about water, because obviously water is important in life. So we have rivers, we have streams, we have, a lot of countries have a shoreline, fishing. And I could see there was a lot of different sea folk. And at the same time, I was thinking of my parents' journey, because they were immigrants that came over from Hong Kong to the UK, and how, they'd come over, and also simultaneously seeing things that were happening more contemporaneously in the media, with some very heated discussions about immigration and refugees and things. And it all sort of mashed up in my head. And I think I am more interested generally in writing more modern fantasy. And to me, I really like the idea of cities, and cities being multicultural melting pots. I love it whenever I go down to London. You see that immediately, you step in the subway and there's so many different languages, there's so many different people, different cultures, different creeds, all there in this tight space. But then if you live in those sort of cities, you also see there's pockets, you know, people, communities set up in different areas in a city. And if you're in that community, it's so different to being outside it as a visitor. And what I wanted to represent is a modern multicultural city, but having the sea folk as part of that multiculturalism. And it sort of made sense then that I was bringing them in from all these different cultures to show that that's what happens in cities. It's not just, you know, completely from one culture, even though it is, I say, East and Southeast Asian inspired. In cities in East and Southeast Asia in real life, there are people from different cultures. So why not have the mythology sort of representing a bit of that melting pot, if that makes sense?
I mean, that makes absolute sense. And I absolutely loved that. I mean, you know, it's basically those who know me will not be surprised to hear that I am always for like intercultural dialogue and exchange. And that is very visible in your book. I mean, you know, what you mentioned about like the big cities as well, you know, I came from a very homogenous country, a very homogenous culture, to London. And it was just such a wonderful experience for me to suddenly come across all of those different cultures. And, you know, now nearly 20 years later, you know, I was literally checking out of a supermarket today, and I had run out of some like spices. So I just bought some jeera and coriander powder. And the checkout lady was like, "Oh, do you cook with that?" And I was just like, "Yes." And it took me a second to realize like why she was asking me that. And I was wondering, like, is there something wrong with this particular brand? Like, what were you doing?
Yeah.
And then I thought, like, isn't it beautiful actually? Because she was very pleased. She was very happy
Yeah.
that that people outside of her culture like actually do access that. And I thought how interesting it is now when we have a lot of sort of those opposing forces sort of pushing against each other, where people who sort of feel very uncomfortable and they want to become more insular and more sort of entrenched in their traditions. And we see that across the globe in different cultures as well. You know, we see, like, you know, in China, we see the like Han revival and the sort of this excitement about like a particular ethnic group, you know, like to the detriment of others. Often. And then we have, you know, in Poland, we have like a bit of a Slavic revival right now, where people are like looking back. But it can be used as a tool to sort of move that exchange forward, I think, or it can be used to sort of separate further. And when you're talking about those three different characters that you have that use different methods to try and better for conditions, like, can you talk a bit more about that and what those different methods are?
Yeah, I think it was really important to me because the first draft I did try to write from one character's point of view, and then I really struggled because I was like, well, she's not right. But then I thought, well, it makes more sense if I show that there are different points of view, and, you know, you may not agree with all of it, or you may disagree with all of it, but also I guess it comes from the idea that, so thinking of some of the things you just said there, about how there's some narratives, I guess, in real life and in books of this culture can be quite homogeneous. And, you know, like, I think fantasy is also, it's also part of that sort of, you know, if you see if your traditional elves or whatever, the elves all do this elf thing and the orcs do the orc thing. So I very much wanted to show that it wasn't just one special individual, you know, that thought outside of the norms of whatever the culture that was. It was three, so that they could show three different points of view. So I've got Nami, who's the newly arrived water dragon who arrives in the city, and she's literally never, she's from an underwater haven, which is where the Fathomfolk sort of live if they don't live in the multicultural city. So the underwater haven is run by the Fathomfolk, and this is the first time she's been in this human city, and she comes with all of her own prejudices and all of her own assumptions about the city, as people do, you know, like, I've heard of this big city, it's big and scary, and they do that over there. She's never actually lived in it. And she also, what I also wanted to show is not just about her sort of a race or whatever you want to call it, her being a Fathomfolk. It was also that she is a dragon, which is a highly privileged position in her culture. So whilst she has all these thoughts, she's also never had to live at the bottom of the heap. She's never faced the conditions that some of the others have. Then we have Mira, who's the half siren, who's second generation, born and brought up in the city, and she very much was the sort of more diaspora identity of being caught between these two worlds and not quite knowing where to fit in. And people saying, where are you from originally, and going, well, that's a horrible question for me to answer because I was born here, even if I don't look like how other people look. And she's very much the sort of poster girl, seen as that, oh look, we've raised one person up in the ranks, that'll do.
Oh, yes.
And she yeah, so she's trying to enact change through sort of legal means by like using the system, but it's slow and it's hard, and she's been doing it for years. And then the third main character is Cordelia, who is a sea witch who is basically been in the city for generations, but is always going to be an outsider, both from the humans and actually the other Fathomfolk, because sea witches are generally seen as untrustworthy, which I also thought was an interesting distinction, because it's not just discrimination between cultures, it can also be intracultural differences that I wanted to highlight. And she is basically like, well, screw it, the system's broken, it's why should I help the other Fathomfolk? I'm just going to help myself and my family, because why not exploit the loopholes? Why should I help anyone else? Which is also a position that some people have. So yeah, it was showing that
it made me think of untouchables, actually, in that sort of traditional caste system in India. And did you think about that at all, or did you sort of arrive at that point from a different angle?
I wasn't thinking particularly about caste systems. I was thinking of the fact that within sort of within communities, like communities that from the outside you would say, oh, there's the this ethnic minority community or LGBT community or any sort of minority community, to be honest, it looks homogeneous. But once you're in that community, there's all sorts of differences. There's infighting, there's class differences, there's differences of people who do want the same thing, often the change, but how they're going to enact it. And there are people that do it selfishly, and there are people that do it for the community, and there are people that think, actually, we need to break all the rules, and there are people that want to play by the rules. And that's what I wanted to show, is we don't all have the same hive mind, which I think it can be reduced to, like, can you explain your whole culture for me? I'm like, I know I can. I can explain my specific understanding of it, but I don't speak for all people. I don't speak for all people from Scotland, never mind all people from, whose parents are from Hong Kong. It's, I can only talk about what I know. And that was very much the vibe I was trying to give.
I think that is such an important point to be making right now, actually, because we see everything flattened and, via media, sort of social media, and a lot of things are sort of portrayed through the angle of American culture as well, which is its own thing. And yet we're trying to view things like race and ethnicity and culture through that particular lens. And I think, like, it was really interesting to me when sort of discussions of sort of cultural appropriation come up. Sometimes, like, I've had people reach out to me personally asking, like, it was literally asking permission to write about Slavic mythology. And that was mind-blowing to me, because I thought, well, research it and write about it. Like, obviously, don't, do it respectfully. Like, I'd assume if you love something so much, you're going to write a book about it, you're going to do it respectfully. That is, that would be my hope. But why? And for one, I was like, why am I in a position to give you permission? Like, why am I in a position to give you permission to access my culture? Like, I will not have the same answer for you as another Polish person. Just because I'm Polish, it doesn't mean I speak for all Poles. And like, this essentialism is just bizarre to me. It's just like when you have, you know, like you mentioned, other marginalized, you know, like groups, you know, like not just sort of racial groups, but like sort of LGBT sort of, you can't expect one person, you know, like you can't expect a gay man to be able to speak for the experience of like the whole rest of a sort of umbrella group, right? Like you can't, those experiences are different, and there will be different points of view, like you mentioned, and that dialogue is so important. And yet we have people who will try to speak for everyone else and make their voices heard most of all, like the dragon you mentioned, you know, that you described. And that leads me into a kind of next question that I had for you, which is, the characters in your novel live in a very stratified society, like you mentioned, with the humans living sort of quite literally above everybody else. But I found it interesting how you sort of, the Fathomfolk ought to be logically more powerful than the humans. I mean, they have their own abilities, they have their own powers, and humans just happen to live up there. So how did you decide on that society structure, and how did you sort of think about distributing power within that story?
I think some of it was just literally, it made sense to me, as I say, that the Fathomfolk representing immigration, representing people that have come from, I don't want to call it motherland, source land, you know, from a different culture, and come to the city a bit more, because like the actual symbolism of mythological sea folk. And I think that was a little bit of a, I'm just gonna play with this and it's fantasy, so I'll do what I fancy. I do think though, if you look at a lot of cultures, you know, there is that social difference, like quite a stark difference between the haves and have-nots in a lot of countries. And it's also a truth that in a lot of countries with densely populated cities, the higher up you are is normally the wealthier you are. And, you know, like the people that are poorer off are literally at the bottom.
I mean, that is virtually how humans just operate,
Yeah.
isn't it? It's just that people, like, you know, the hierarchy is purely economical in many ways. In the people who kind of rule over the rest of us have more resources. But here, like, you know, the Fathom folk have their own resources, and they have their own sort of power structures. And how did you sort of press against, you know, like a kappa being able to simply, you know, dispose of a human, really, and
Oh,
yet
so
they're kept below?
So in the plot, it's very much that the underwater havens, which is, I guess, the ancestral sort of homes of the Fathomfolk, are failing, and it's very subtle, I think, in the final draft, because in the original there was a lot more about pollution and things like that. So the cities and the wars and stuff that have happened have polluted the waters, and so it's actually very difficult for a lot of the Fathomfolk to live full time underwater. So they have to spend part of the time on land, because there's a disease called gill rot in the novel. And it's partly to do with the pollution in the waters and the humans having much better technology. So they are the ones that have built the cities that go above the waterline. So and they're economic hubs in this world. So that's why it sort of makes sense for the Fathomfolk to want to immigrate to the cities. And then obviously the humans are a bit nervous of the Fathomfolk, because they have this basically water magic. A lot of them are shapeshifters, and a lot of them, can use water magic to, you know, just generally as part of their identity. So the humans at the beginning of the novel, it's already in place that they have a device called a pakalot, which is like a magical bracer, which basically stops the Fathomfolk from using any of the water magic offensively against humans. So they can use it in their daily lives, as long as it's not used for attack. And that's sort of like the method of control. And then other things come to light through the novel as to what exactly humans have done, and agreements that have been made in the past with the Fathomfolk. It sort of unfolds as the novel unfolds.
I mean, it's really interesting, like the way you can see parallels in your story with sort of what's happening in politics at the moment, and the way that certain conversations go, like when it comes to the issue of like the humans being afraid of the powers that the Fathomfolk have. I think it could be argued that that is a legitimate worry in some way, that if someone is so much more powerful than you, that leaves you vulnerable, and humans do not like to leave themselves vulnerable. And I was wondering about that kind of, like, I like that was put in, because it made me think of how we sort of treat immigrants sometimes, throughout Europe, and that there's all those sort of control measures put in to kind of, like, we have to give them courses on how to assimilate. We have to, and some of it is obviously, hugely beneficial. You're going to, if someone's coming to your country and you're helping them to learn the language, and, you're helping them. I had some friends in Poland who were involved in kind of teaching refugees Polish, which is a very difficult language to master. And that can mean, can make a huge difference. But I'm talking about the sort of means of control that stem out of fear. Like, how do you sort of feel about that? And how did you sort of think about it when writing the book, in terms of, on the one hand, that there is like a power imbalance between the humans and the Fathomfolk, and then how that power imbalance was dealt with in, something that is quite like a brutal limitation put on the Fathomfolk?
I think, as you say, I mean, it's hard because obviously my novel is quite modern fantasy, so it's very easy to go real life analogies, and obviously there is, and I am obviously wanting people to think, but at the same time it is a fiction, and like, I clearly don't have all of the solutions and answers, because if I did, I would be running the country, or I'd be trying to. So
you would, if you had all the answers and solutions, the
yeah.
one thing you would not be doing is running this country.
That's true, sadly. But you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I think what I want to pose the questions. I want people to think about it and have these discussions. I don't think I have the ideal answer of to how it's all figured out. I would say, in terms of what I was playing with very much the notion of, when people go, why do people cross an ocean to get here? Like, why would you leave everything and do that? If you're moaning then about the conditions, if you're saying this isn't great, and it's like, well, people do, and like, as you say, it seems a bit unbelievable that Fathomfolk would let themselves have this manacle on their arm, but is sort of thematically that is often
that
what
is happens.
Very
relevant.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're saying is like, the questions are generally more interesting than the answers from my point of view. So
I think it's just I don't have the answers, because I think I know some early readers have said, well, why don't they make it perfect or do this, and I'm like, well, if I had the answer, I would love to have the answers, but if it was that easy a fix that as a debut author I could fix it all, I really would. But yeah, it's a very much, it's a book that I want people to talk about, and maybe you're going to disagree with everything or some things or some of the characters' point of view, but I hope that that's a conversation starter, and I think that was my main aim. But also, I think we can get really bogged down in the heavy stuff, but I also want to highlight that I also wanted it to be a book about the small joys that you find in multiculturalism and living in the city. And yes, there are bigger questions and there are things that are broken, but the characters still find moments of joy and love and things like that as well. It's not just all a downer.
I didn't think it was a downer at all. I just find it interesting. And it's, what you said about some people saying, like, why didn't you just sort of give a clear answer? Like, the fact that you have those three different main characters that had completely different points of view and completely different solutions to the same problem, as it were. It just shows that there is no such thing as one clear answer to any one question, because you will always have different perspectives and different interests, and you can't always reconcile all of them neatly. And I think people would love to be able to think that there is one neat way of solving it, but instead, like like you say, like you just have to find a way to find small joys along the way as you try to muddle through.
Definitely.
The when you so you mentioned that you have always been interested in folklore, and that you sort of consumed huge amounts of folklore from all different countries. When we think about there's been a lot of folklore in fantasy in recent years. I mean, all my books are basically Slavic folklore inspired as well, and it's just been quite a sort of high of that. And we see a lot of retellings. And how do you sort of look at how we change and adapt folklore to sort of further modern conversations?
I love this, and I really enjoy the retellings revival right now. I think it's fun. I love seeing, as you say, from different cultures. And I love that recently it has been very much feminist retellings of, typically the Greek, but actually there's more than that out there. Like your own, like Kaikeyi, by Vaishnavi Patel. I've completely forgotten all the other ones, but there's quite a few out there. I do think, looking across the world, very sadly, a lot of folklore is based on patriarchal, misogynistic norms, and like what I was frustrated by particularly was a lot of like the siren, the mermaid, the Rusalka. They're often either evil temptresses or damsels that just die, and sometimes they're both. Sometimes they're damsels that die and then become evil temptresses. Everywhere in the world there is sadly this thematic. Look at this woman who is beautiful. Yes.
Whereas someone just pointed out, Rusalka is just basically hanging out in her lake, happens to be pretty. She's not forcing those men to go. And yeah.
Yeah. But and that's where the siren came from, actually, because I remember obviously reading the Odyssey or bits and just going, what do these sirens do when there are no boats full of men nearby? Do they just live their lives? Why are they drowning this man? What's the purpose? But their purpose is to move the narrative of the man on his journey along, and outside of that, it doesn't matter if they have any sort of motives or what do they want to do in their lives. And I very much wanted to take that one with me around, think, what if you're a siren and you cannot switch it off? It's part of who you are. As you say, you're just a beautiful woman and everyone's going around going, you're a siren. And it very much has that modern day connotations of, women, you're asking for it if you wear a short skirt. And that's part of who she is, and she can't switch it off. And she is very much a character who tries to, do something a siren wouldn't do. She goes into the military and she dresses always in her military outfit, and because she's so wants to rally against this, but it's also quite sad in some ways because it is part of who she is, and there's plot points that happen later, but why should you deny part of who you are just because the society is telling you it's a bad thing? And I wanted her journey to be one of thinking about that and sort of embracing both sides of our culture. But yeah, that's what I really do love about the retellings right now, is that there's feminist retellings that are taking the narrative back. I love as well that you can have the same folk story and you could give it to 20 different authors and they would retell it in a different way. It feels so right, because I think when I think of folklore, I think of asking my mum about stories and her telling me the stories that she had in her childhood, and then me trying to find these stories in books or Wikipedia, and they're not the same ones. And to this day, I don't know if she actually just made them up, or perhaps in the village that she grew up in, these were the versions. And just because someone didn't write it down in a book doesn't make it any more legitimate. Folklore always has evolved through the tellings. It's evolved through time. You know, in Asian cinema particularly, there's a massive amount of retellings. Like they do Journey to the West maybe every 5-10 years. Someone does another TV series or another film of it, and they retell it over and over again. And there's this joy in the familiarity of it, but at the same time, each retelling, they tweak it a bit and they make it, you know, their own version or a bit more modern. And I think that's human nature. There's something good about new stories, obviously, but there's also something good about that little bit of familiarity. It's like having your favorite cup of tea or your biscuit and going, oh yeah, but this one's got a new topping on it. And I, as you can tell, really like that myself. I think it's a fun way of playing a bit in someone else's sandpit, but also because it's folklore, you can really make it your own, and no one's going to come out and slap you for copyright.
No, I mean, it's I think there is that like what you call it, like fan fiction element to playing with the stories, but in essence, like what you mentioned about your mom's sort of way of telling you the stories, that is what people have done for millennia. And I remember I spoke to this author Alison Littlewood, and she put it really beautifully, I thought, in that she described oral storytelling as kind of layers of sediment, like kind of geological, like so made into a geological metaphor, and that you have all, like every layer of sediment, every new person telling the story adds a little bit of something, maybe takes something away, but then adds a little bit of something. And it's something that, you know, in definitely when I've seen in Slavic folklore, but kind of pre-Christian Slavic folklore, felt like a completely different beast to what we have with the kind of Christian elements added. So that was a different form of retelling with a very particular goal in mind. And humans have always done it, you know. Robin Hood didn't originally fight on behalf of King Richard. Okay, you know, Robin, as you might know, like Robin Hood was a peasant. He was a commoner. And then, because the story was getting too popular and but too dangerous, you know, around the time of peasant uprisings, he suddenly became a noble who was writing for the rightful king. So he was doing the same stuff, but with a different motivation behind it. You know, when you're talking about kind of changing and adapting the story, sometimes I think the most powerful stories are just from a slightly different point of view. You know, like when Madeline Miller did in Circe and Achilles, or Pat Barker, who wrote The Silence of the Girls, about the Trojan War. Have you read that one?
I've not read that. I've read Circe though.
Yeah, I mean, the Pat Barker sort of The Silence of the Girls is quite a heavy read. It is not a favorite cup of tea kind of retelling, I'm afraid. But it's basically told through the girls captured by the Greeks during the Trojan War. So it's told from a point of view of Briseis, and that's all it takes to sort of suddenly look at the hero, the golden Achilles, the beautiful Achilles, slightly differently.
Yes, from the other side.
So going into a kind of, you touched on it a little bit earlier about the tokenism of Mira as the sort of half siren, that is one of the very few of Fathomfolk that is allowed into kind of any governmental like branch position, any kind of position of authority. And she sort of makes multiple comments along about being a tick box in a council, a head. The quote I really like was the head bobbing recruitment pamphlet. So how did you sort of position her like that, and what was the point of that and the reason behind it?
Yeah, so Mary's character is interesting. I wanted someone who, you know, knew and had been discriminated against, but was trying to still do her best to change the system legitimately. So as you say, at the beginning of the novel, she's just been appointed captain of the border guard, and she's the highest Fathomfolk in any sort of branch of government, but it's still on the outskirts because she just for some reason didn't pass the scholar exams, which clearly were rigged, is the implication. And the other positions within the city guard are also very much given to the children and the relatives of other sort of upper class human members. So this is as far as she can get. And I wanted to play with this idea of what do you do when you kind of know your position is a tick box, where you've been let in as we've ticked our minority box, but still at least you've been let in. Like you can do some good once you're in. You can sort of break that glass ceiling and sort of help other people up. And that's very much her personality as well. You know what? At least we've got, I've pushed it further than anyone else has pushed it. I'm going to help others up. And that's very much her personality of, with hard work, we'll get there in the end, which I think obviously has its pros and cons. She's very much sort of, as much as the Fathomfolk are trusted by the humans, she's probably like the most trusted one, and she's seen as the most, like, as you say, poster girl. I also was thinking of people actually at the time like Obama. So when he was elected president of America, and obviously it was a massive first at the time, but I remember a lot of narratives going on around social media and like thought pieces in newspapers saying it's not just that he's the first African-American man that's got to his position, he also has to be the best African-American man. He can't have any scandals. He can't ever get drunk. He has to be the perfect family man. He can't do
people try to spin a tan suit into a scandal.
Yes. Whereas you think of politicians that have come since and how much they have got away with, that if he had an ounce of any of that on him, I'm sure that it would have just been so difficult, because he had to be perfect. And that's very much how I modeled Mira, that she feels she has to be perfect because she is in such a spotlight, and it's tough, it's a burden, and obviously she isn't perfect. And but that's how she feels, and that's often how a lot of people, I'm sure, feel when they're put in that position of you must speak for your whole community. Yeah,
I think it's an interesting tension between the community and the individual as well, in the sense that I think we sometimes, especially in the context of this kind of diversity tick boxing, we put a lot of pressure on individuals to represent their community and to kind of be the force of good for the community as a whole, completely ignoring that we are not asking the same of anybody else. And I was thinking actually about how there should be nothing wrong with Mira wanting to pursue her own personal goals and just further her own career. Like, what is wrong with this girl just wanting to better his, to sort of have a better life, to have a better options? Why does she have to be a spokesperson?
Yeah, which is sort of the Cordelia point of view. I know she sort of goes about it in interesting ways, but like, why should I do good for the community? They've never helped me, and I'm just going to do good for my own people. And it's a legitimate point of view. Like, not everyone engages in equal amounts to whatever culture they're in. Some people, are indifferent. Some people are, super into it. It's everyone's individual choice. Yes.
I mean, I think in terms of sort of a publishing industry,
Hmm.
there's been a lot sort of talked about, like diversity as a thing that people do. And I feel like sometimes, like very often it is conceptualized in this tick boxing way that actually quite like impedes on the creativity of marginalized people on one hand, and then doesn't actually help to truly diversify the sort of publisher's portfolio. Like, I mean, I know from my personal experience when I was sort of my agent was trying to sell one of my books, and we had like 5 different responses that were, we love this book, but like we already have one of those. We already have something Slavic.
Yes.
And the story could be something entirely different, right? But that was like, we have ticked this box. Like I'm sorry, but like, we've done the Slavic, we've done the Japanese, like we need to do the Yoruba next, that's on the box. Like, and it's like, why can't you have all of it?
Yeah. I think when you certainly, like, I know when your debut came out, it was quite when was it now? So it was a few
2021.
Yeah, so
a great year to
oh God.
come out as a debut.
I was like, nothing happened in 2020. Oh no. Oh yeah. I'm hoping it's moved on a bit. I do, and I've certainly heard people similar to you say that, they were told we've got one of those. I do feel it is moving a bit, but it is moving depending on what they're seeing selling a lot of the time. So, like I have to be so grateful for all of the writers of color, diverse writers before me that have done a lot of the heavy lifting. By the time I think I went out on submission, it wasn't the case, at least for me. We never heard that. And I think my book is so out there. It's like, yes, do you want an Asian inspired flooded sea mythology modern fantasy? I can't say that they had that tick box because nobody, I don't think that tick box exists.
So that was actually really it felt like you had fun with it, and I really like that. But like you and it seems like you might have been just given like a really very supportive sort of team behind you that like allowed you to just have fun with it and not be constrained by the expectation that, well, Eliza Chan, now that you did represent the Chinese diaspora in Scotland, like
Yes.
like did you like at any point perhaps like before selling the book maybe like feel the pressure to conform to telling a particular kind of story because of your heritage?
I don't think there was any external pressure, to be honest. I think my agent and my editor have always been entirely supportive. They did have some questions about, oh, why did you do this? But when I explained it, they were like, that's fine. I think a lot of it was in my own head and in what was happening, as you say, the conversations happening on social media and happening with other authors. So like hearing their stories was really useful about what other authors had been through that debuted long before me. And that's why I say I'm so glad that they did all that groundwork. And like there was a lot of authors that have proven that this horrible bracket of Asian fantasy, but exists, Asian fantasy is sellable, and that very much was done by people before me. It was done by the likes of Fonda Lee and Silin Tan and like Tasha Suri and people going, look, it's sellable. I think the danger of that would be a lot of what people like in that Asian fantasy bracket is sort of C-drama inspired, wuxia inspired, beautiful romance. And I love that stuff. Absolutely love it. Watch it, will read it. Cannot write it. I'm not a great romance writer. I'm not a great happily ever after writer. I like modern things. I like things that are a bit morally grey, a bit like,
I wouldn't say that
questions.
I wouldn't say that you're not good at it. I would say that is not your main point of interest.
Yes, yeah. And so my own personal worry was always, oh no, I'm Asian and I'm writing fantasy, they're going to expect wuxia and romance. Nobody ever explicitly said to me, my editor, my agent never said you must write wuxia romance, but I had it in my own head, because that's what I could see was becoming popular. And I think the self-doubts are almost as bad, I think, when you are someone who is from a sort of minority diverse background, because you think maybe that's my only shot, maybe I should write in that, and then you think, well, no, because ultimately you have to write what you enjoy writing and what you're good at writing, because yeah, don't force yourself into that if it doesn't work for you. And obviously the people that are doing it well enjoy writing it, and they're doing it successfully. So I do think that a lot of the worries were in my own head, but I also, as I say, think that I debuted a very good time, or debuted, I'm not out yet. I got my deal at a very good time where a lot of that groundwork had been already laid down by other authors. And then I think a lot of them, I've listened to their stories about how much harder they found it and how many shelf novels they have. And I have so much respect, and just want to say thank you to all of them for opening the doors a bit wider for my weird story to then find a home.
I think it's just because it feels fresh because of how much you mixed in different folklores. And I was thinking, like, one thing I was thinking about in terms of the storytelling is what's sometimes referred to as the exposition tax. And in that, writers that describe anything culturally different from the kind of very Anglo-centric influences are essentially forced to devote pages upon pages to the detailed description of certain cultural practices, and then I was thinking, well, you've mashed up a lot of different folklore, so that might triple the exposition tax on on your book. What was your position on that? Did you worry about that at all?
I think because I was just doing, like, say, it's the mashup of all the mythologies, but also this semi-submerged city is just utterly, I wouldn't say utterly my own design. It's so novel. No one else has ever thought of it. No, but it isn't something that has, even, within Chinese or East and Southeast Asian, there's no, oh, this is what it looks like as a semi-submerged city. I was making that up as I went along. So I picked this because I thought there would be less world building if I didn't go down the epic fantasy route. Fool that I am. What actually happened is a lot of world building, but a lot of world building that I got to do it however I wanted to, because it was quite different to a lot of what was out there. So I ended up reading lots about different sort of cultures that live in boats or stilt houses, floodplains, monsoon rains and things like that. But then also just looked up fascinating articles about technology that is sort of being developed now, like crop walls and growing vegetables on salt water that no culture currently does successfully, but they can do in my fantasy novel. So I really enjoyed that. I think obviously there is an exposition tax in terms of I had to explain what was going on in the first probably third of the novel of this is the status quo of the city before things turn around. But I quite enjoyed it, and I think it helped with the 3 viewpoint characters because they can go into different parts of the city, and Nami being a new arrival, which is obviously the good trick you do as a writer, going, oh, you're newly arrived, let's tour you around a little bit. But it felt, because it was such a mashup world of my own creation, I felt less bothered that I was going, I need to explain this Chinese thing or whatever, because it's not. I was explaining this thing that was entirely my own invention, and of course I had to explain it because no one else knew what it was apart from my Pinterest board.
I need to look at that Pinterest board now. I'm very curious. It's sometimes when people rebel against it, I think that is very interesting, but as well in terms of exposition tax and just being well, you don't need to understand it. Just like imagine that you're in that place and you won't understand every single thing that you come across. And I was interviewing Stephen Aryan about his new sort of Mongolian and Persian inspired book. And he was saying how fun it was for him to put the little Easter eggs, like cultural Easter eggs. So he's like, well, only someone with my culture background, will actually be instantly cognizant of what I'm doing here. And that's fine. Like, it doesn't affect the big arc of the story. Like, you'll still be able to sort of absorb the whole story, but there's like the little bits that I will just not explain. And and I think it really adds to the book as well.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite comments was I got a message from an early reader who's of, I think, Asian American background, who liked the book, which is obviously great, but in particular was like, it made me hungry because of all like the food market stalls, and like a lot of them were based off like hawker stalls that you have in East and Southeast Asia, and some of the foods were real food, but some of them are just ones I made up, but they have the feel of a market stall. And she was just like, I was so hungry afterwards, I had to go out and get food. And I was like, yes, I wanted that. But as you say, it was just little hints there for someone, if you've ever been at those sort of hawker stalls, you would get the feeling, but they were not integral to plot, that I was just adding in curried fish balls and things like that.
I love that. So what next?
So it's a duology, and I have finished the first-ish draft of the second book, and it's with my editor at the moment, so that's on its way, but obviously has to have a few edits, I'm sure. And then beyond that, I'm sort of tinkering to see what comes next. I think I will very much stay in the wheelhouse of mashups. I like mashups. I think it's very much.
They've served you well. I think they've served you well.
So I think we'll see if they're interested in it. But it's very much another mashup, but this one more based in like an alt reality 19th century Hong Kong. But I like the mashup. I've always liked the sort of East meets West mashup, because I feel like that's who I am. I'm an East meets West mashup. So it's, so that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking hopping vampires, and I'm thinking, British officers, and let's see if it sells.
I am really excited to read it now.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to sort of end the interview. Thank you so much again for agreeing to come on and talking about your lovely book, Fathomfolk. You should all go out and buy it.
Oh my God, it's out on the 29th of February in the UK and 27th in the US, and it's shiny. Well, the UK one's shiny.
Yeah, I think by the time this episode goes live, it'll already be out. So I'll put the links in the description below so that you can easily find it.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the video. Every week there's something different, so click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you, and see you next week.